Hello, you. How are you doing? Recently, I've actually talked to Chris Flavin, who was working for Gridwork, a very interesting company that are sort of rebuilding a new model for transmission and distribution, right? Functioning, working, mainly on renewable. It's very interesting. For this week, I'm bringing you forward to the CEO of this company, just to have the same kind of conversation, but to give you a lot more insight. So I tell you what, you definitely want to be looking at that. So what? Because we're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to be talking about obviously who is Chris Simon Hodson. That's the person. That's the man I'm talking about here. Also want to understand what makes Gridworks such a special, innovative company, and also understanding about what project they're working on. That Moyi Power they mentioned, yeah. What is actually driving them to develop this project, and also understanding what kind of impact it can have. Right. I tell you what. There is a lot you're going to learn in this episode. So stay tuned and thank you for connecting.
Welcome to Renewables in Action,
your unique podcast.
Do you want to understand the renewable energy sector, its trends, business models, and insights? Are you interested in learning about the challenges and opportunities, as well as how you or your business can thrive in this new world? Welcome to Renewables in Action, the show that helps you realize your potential in this industry, which is the fastest growing source of energy in the world. Here is your host, Tony, to you.
Okay, last week we had, in fact, earlier this week, so I had the pleasure to talk to a very interesting company in Gridworks and tell you everything about what they do. So I've interviewed Chris Flavin, who's the head of international development, but today I'm even more privileged because I'm talking to the CEO of the company, Mr. Simon Hodson. So, but I'm not going to tell you much more than that because Simon, welcome first of all into our podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Excellent. So, Simon, I think before we actually crack on, I think people are always impressed, talking about CEO of a very innovative company. So I'd like to find out who is Simon Hodson and actually what is driving you on the day-to-day basis.
Great question, Tony. I, what I love about Gridworks, and Gridworks is a journey that had its origins in 2018. So I came along and was asked if I would like to set up this platform, and I pitched to the then CDC people who were driving this initiative, and 5 years, close to 5 years later, we have more than 20 very enthusiastic, passionate people working in Gridworks. We have 4 investments in a range of innovative and unique investments. One of which you talked about with Chris Flavin last week. And I think what drives me and what has always driven me as an individual is doing things which haven't been done before. If I look back at I was doing things in Cuba 25 years ago. It always fascinates me to attempt to do things which haven't been done before. And I think electricity network investment, which is what we are all about at Gridworks, developing and investing in electricity networks and creating sustainable models that can absorb the renewables desperately needed, that can be undertaken in a sustainable in all parts of what we mean by sustainable, but certainly financially sustainable, is what drives me and what drives my team. Everybody is passionate. It's difficult when you're doing something which hasn't been done before. It is not easy, and it's a big challenge. But I think close to 5 years into the journey, I think there is a overwhelming tide of change and recognition that capital, not just capital, but capital and associated private sector practices need to come into electricity networks.
Okay, so hold on a minute, because I just want to make sure that I heard it correctly. Are you saying that you're the one who initially pitched this idea to CDC now or now BII?
No, it was not. I think there was a long gestation period within BII for a number of years. A couple of my colleagues, Chris Flavin and Sean Gethuku, came from BII before they joined Gridworks, and they were both working for a number of years in the incubation period, as I call it, in BI, when they were looking and evaluating T&D, transmission and distribution, as a sort of key bottleneck to the development of the sector. So there's, and of course, CDC has its origins of investing in the sector through UMEME back in 2004. One of the very few examples of investment in this sector. So no, I didn't pitch it. It spent a number of years in the incubation department, so to speak, at CDC.
Okay, it's great to see that now the baby is being born. So it's great to see
It
that.
certainly has, and we're growing up rapidly. Yeah, but
Excellent.
it's a long journey, and it will be a long journey.
And obviously, you say that you always fail to attempt or to do things that have never been done before. So, what actually really, in your word, what makes Gridworks a platform that is unique, and why are you so convinced that it will succeed?
Let's take the second part of your question first. It's inevitable that private sector capital will flow into this way. I mean, Africa is the only continent in the planet that doesn't have private sector capital flows into transmission, or indeed in a significant way, and even into the distribution space in any material way. And I think we saw what happened in South America, Latin America, in the last 20, 30 years, with large-scale private sector capital coming into the transmission space. And it really has transformed the amount of capital, the amount of critical infrastructure available through those capital flows. And I'm sure the same thing will happen in Africa. It's there's lots of statistics about the lack of infrastructure, whether that in any shape or form in electricity networks. Africa as a continent has fewer kilometers of transmission lines than Brazil, whole continent, and it's generally a lack of capital, and a lack of capital comes from the origins of why there's a lack of capital come from ostensibly because it's been a highly politicized environment, electricity networks, and there needs to be general recognition that it doesn't necessarily need to be a highly politicized piece of infrastructure as exists in many other continents around the world. Africa needs the capital, and it needs the capital to flow into commercially sustainable projects and investments, and this will allow absorption of a greater amount of renewables in the process too.
And that's you definitely should need to be commended for what you're doing there, because clearly you sort of demonstrated the way forward to many people, and hopefully in the next few years people will follow your good step. So I'd like to come back into a little bit more practical level, because I know in 2021 you started a major project, which is the Moyi Power, where you sort of rebuilding 24/7 grid that will absorb a lot of renewables. Never been done before, and looking forward to see how it actually will be planned out. And you've also been involved into other projects, Virunga, Amari. So just wanted to know now, on a day-to-day basis, in realizing those projects, what kind of challenges are you coming across, and how do you get the team still motivated to go beyond that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the challenges come in lots of different shapes and sizes. And let's take Moyi Power as an example. It's a very novel, innovative way of structuring what is sometimes called metro grids, sometimes called it's basically a greenfield vertically integrated utility, supplying the generation, the transmission, the distribution, all the way to the end user. The problem is, partially because these structures are new and untested. We think they can be very, very interesting models for electrification, wider application in DRC, and indeed more widely in Africa, because they are sustainable. They are financially sustainable, which means they do not require donor subsidies on an ongoing basis. There is a capital buy-down grant at the beginning, but other than that, they become sustainable models that can evolve and grow in the decades ahead. That's one of the first challenges, because it's all new. It's new for the donors, it's new for the investors, it's new for the lenders, it's new for the regulator in DRC, and it's new for the government of DRC. But logistically, the challenges are that these three cities, Gemena, Bumba, and Isiro in the north of DRC, are a very, very long way away from anywhere. The Isiro to Kinshasa is 2,000 kilometers. It's Moscow to London is a shorter distance. So the travel, moving to these places is very, very challenging. Getting equipment and kit and almost anything to these places is challenging and expensive. So the logistics of Moyi Power add to the challenge of doing something which is a first and a new for everybody involved. Amari is, which I think you spoke with Chris last week, which is the transmission infrastructure project in Uganda. The first to be financed through private sector means on the continent, in fact, and the first in Uganda, is challenging because it's also new. It's new for the government of Uganda. It's new for the Minister of Energy, the regulator, the transmission services company. It's new for everybody. Now, whilst what we are doing, it closely resembles, it's not a million miles away from an IPP in the generation space, it is nevertheless, it's new and it's different, and it requires a lot of understanding and patience to go through the various processes to do something which is new and a different way of financing something. And we would not have been in that situation really without a forward-looking, receptive government, as we have with the government of Uganda, and that's what we look for in Gridworks when we're choosing to where, because there is a need across the entire continent, but it's these the regimes and governments that are receptive to what private sector capital and practices and associated way of doing things can deliver for their economy, and are prepared to be receptive to the challenge and the learnings required to make it happen.
And here is a question I have for you for those projects. So how can you guarantee that at the end of the concession, they will be both affordable and profitable? So obviously we're not talking about the same stakeholder here, right? So the affordability, that's for the end users. The profitability is more towards your funders, and your investors. So how can you demonstrate, what makes you sure that you'll be able to meet both those requirements?
Interesting question. I think more importantly, it's how do we can guarantee it at the start of the concession. 20 years into the future is 20 years into the future, but the affordability when you're developing a greenfield grid is particularly in Africa, which has affordability challenges, is very key. So we have had to undertake very, very extensive on the ground surveys or household surveys in all three cities in the north of DRC over the last 12 months, 15 months, to determine what is the level of affordability throughout the target parts of these cities, and that's not a quick task. So we've spent a huge amount of time and effort determining what is considered an acceptable level of affordability, and these things take time. These things take a lot of effort. Clearly, you have to do this work, and then there is if you like, the donors and the donor funding will be required in order to get the cost of the tariff down to a level that is affordable. We know what affordable means in terms of dollars per month in these cities, and the rest is basically simple arithmetic and the availability of donor funds to bring that tariff to an affordable level. The way the Moyi Power concession works means that the initial investment, probably about $130 million in the initial form, but that the capital will grow over the 20 years of concession as demand grows, as population grows and demand grows and the economy grows. So we expect the total amount of investment to double or triple over the period, the 20 years of concession, and all of that growth will be funded in line with the demographic and the evolving demand of these cities.
Mm. So you doing business in DRC and in Uganda, and these are not necessarily places people will see as places where it's easy to do business. They see the continent of Africa in general usually as risky. And I'd be curious to understand, because I like to see a lot more people doing work just like what you are doing. So how are you managing those risks?
Look, I mean, doing business in the areas that we are working in the African continent is has risk, has considerable risk, and we are very fortunate in our shareholder BII to have capital that is patient and is able to take the long gestation and development risk necessary to give birth to these sorts of projects. Moyi Power is a model, is a new model that has not been undertaken before, and it has its origins as a project back in 2016-17, when the then DFID created the ESSOR program, which went out to tender, and there was a whole tender process, which has resulted in what has become Moyi Power today. These are very long gestation periods for project development, particularly when you're doing something which hasn't been done before in a way and shape and structure that hasn't been done before. And we are only able to do this because the capital we have within Gridworks allows us to take those very long development risks. Of course, and obviously, it's exactly the same with Amari and the transmission in the transmission space too. What we hope and aspire towards is that these models that we are creating and will crowd in further private sector capital in the years ahead, and that projects like Moyi will be replicated with in a way which has much faster timelines, and projects like Amari will start appearing all over the continent of Africa with much shorter periods, as other governments and ministries of finance and regulators across the continent see this as a very useful financing tool for their critical infrastructure, and it can be done in a faster and faster way, and with greater degree of replication and speed, and in a decade from now, it will start to appear like IPP started to appear after their sort of inception in the 1990s, and it becomes a whole sector in itself.
And these projects that you mentioned, are they the only one you are focusing on, or are you still sourcing projects? And if you're sourcing projects, so how do you source them?
Good question. Let's start as always with the last part of your question first. we will always focus our efforts and activities as a small team where there is greatest degree of receptivity to what we have to offer. That means where often, more often than not, we are interacting with the Ministry of Energy and with the regulator across the continent, and where there is real receptivity to put in place the building blocks necessary for private sector capital to flow in a meaningful way. This is where we will decide to work, because we need to work where there's a reasonable bang for the buck, so to speak. In terms of it's all about return on effort. There are some. Ultimately, there is need across the continent, but there has to be real political receptivity to what we have to offer at Gridworks to make it worthwhile to justify our time and effort in a particular country.
Okay, excellent. That's good to know. So, how do you build capacity and also develop local expertise skill? Because project that you're developing, they will have a long lifetime. So we talk about 20 years and plus here. And the key thing here I can mention would be the management, but also there's the maintenance of these assets, but also probably the management of those assets. So, and I'm sure you're very keen on developing local skills for that. So, how do you go about it? Developing the skills and also building capacity.
Touch on a few different things there, Tony. We will always endeavor to source local talent for our businesses, and continual education of all forms are a core aspect that defines and underpins everything we do at Gridworks. So where the talent is available locally, we will source it. Where it is not available locally, we will find it from elsewhere, perhaps in surrounding jurisdictions. And always we will have a philosophy to train and develop talent at all levels in our businesses. A good example on the transmission side, we recognise that in Gridworks, people who are ostensibly based in London can only do so much. So in Uganda, we have recruited people on the ground. We have a country director there, and we have other resources, and we will increase the resources available locally to take on the development of these projects. And that'll be a similar story in the other countries where we have transmission infrastructure projects under development. We will always look for local teams that can take the project on after a certain point in time. We will sort of guide, we will back, we will resource, we will mentor these local development teams. But ultimately, the nuances and the texture of developing projects in any African country are unique from country to country to country, and you can only do so much from, if you like, what is today predominantly a London-based team. So it's basically our philosophy, but it's also an essential need. You can't develop these projects day to day, week to week, month to month from afar. They need to be developed locally.
Excellent. So last question for you. Obviously, you're traveling to AEF, as I understand. And I just wanted to understand, what are your expectations for this summit? So if you have to summarize them in 3 key objectives, what would they be?
I've been coming to AEF for many years, too numerous to mention. But what I have noticed in the last 3 or 4 or 5 since the Gridworks journey began is there is a growing level of acceptance of the need for investment in electricity networks. I mean, as one of those people doing the first IPPs in Africa in the 1990s, when it was all new, I'm beginning to sense that same feeling about network investment. There will be the first projects and the second and the third, and and I'm hoping, and I'm pretty convinced it will be the case, that will be much more discussion and talk and conversations about the need for network investment, how that investment is going to materialize in distribution, in transmission, the need to have sustainable electricity networks to absorb a greater proportion of renewable energy and to do it in a sustainable way. I've seen this evolve over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and I'm hoping that AEF we will see this conversation come to the next level, and in a further 5 years from now, I'm hoping that network investment and T&D will be well on that journey to becoming an investable asset class in the same way that IPPs were in the 1990s and the 20, 30 years since.
Well, I would say that with people experience as you're talking about being one of the first to push the IPP model in the continent. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of progress made there. So Simon, that's been a very enlightening discussion that I had with you. So I've learned a lot in particular, and I'm looking forward to see you in person in Nairobi, because I'm sure we maybe continue this conversation over a good coffee or tea. So looking forward to that. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Tony. Look forward to it too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode of Renewables in Action. I hope you learned 1 or 2 things today. If you have, please do take action. Also, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast in Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform that you like. You can reach out to me, Tony T, on LinkedIn to connect, to share your feedback. I look forward to speaking with you. Until then, may the sun be with you. See you next time on the Renewables in Action podcast.